Carrying a defective gene doesn't always mean death for most people. Their children might be in danger only if they get together with someone else who carries the same piece of genetic code. It is possible for them to get both recessive copies and a recessive disease. Because our gene pool is pretty big and varied, those things don't happen very often. But if someone can only choose a partner from their own family, that chance can start to rise rapidly as generations pass down genetic material that is identical or very similar. This is called homozygosity. There are a lot of reasons why people might breed with each other, such as being geographically isolated, having limited social opportunities, or experiencing rare but severe abuse. Some groups may just want to stick to the tried and true methods of marrying people from similar backgrounds, which usually leads to them all becoming linked over time. In the past, royal dynasties have been particularly likely to inbreed because family members don't want to share their ridiculously large amounts of money and power with other people. Being socially convinced that some people are unique or even holy can make it less appealing to hook up with regular people. Why, after all, would a god mix their blood with human genes? Through history, all of this means that a small group of people have become very closely related. Some people got lucky and didn't have to deal with the worst effects of their complicated family tree, while others are painful examples of why inbreeding is often seen as wrong. Tuttankamon. Even though ancient Egyptian artists were not frightened of reality, it is unlikely that they intended to depict the deceased pharaoh Tuttankamon in the same way that they had shown him while he was still alive. The glittering, symmetrical glory of his golden death mask veiled a human being beneath it who was most likely very inbred and suffered as a result of it. Specifically, what was it that Tuttankamon had going on? According to a study that was conducted in 2010 and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Connecticut scans of his mummy revealed that the young monarch who passed away at the age of just 19 was struggling with a number of issues. It is possible that the broken leg and the active case of malaria were the most immediate factors that contributed to his passing away. In addition to these conditions, he suffered from a clubfoot, which would have made it impossible for him to walk. He also had scoliosis and a cleft palate. This was made worse by a degenerative disease that was eating away at the bones of his left foot. This made his condition more worse. It is difficult to determine for certain whether or not Tut's problems were all related to his inbreeding due to the fact that so many ancient and historic people have this trait. The research did, however, show that he was almost probably the result of inbreeding among royal family members. It is true that the pharaoh Akhenaten, whom he believed to be his own father, married one of his sisters. Tut was apparently married to his own sister, or half-sister, which may explain why he did not have an heir and was buried with 2 miscarried fetuses in his tomb. Ancient Irish royals. The royal families of ancient Ireland, like the royal families of so many other kingdoms over the course of human history, were not very enthusiastic about sharing their wealth with non-citizens. At the very least, this appears to be the only viable explanation for the genetic makeup of the individual who was laid to rest in the magnificent tomb that was constructed in Neolithic Ireland and known as Newgrange. According to a report that was published in the journal Nature in the year 2020, the man in question was discovered in a particularly well-appointed section of the stone tomb. This section of the tomb was already thought to be reserved for the elites of the time period. Researchers discovered that this man's particular genetic code was extremely intertwined while they were researching the genomes of more than 40 persons who had been buried in and around Newgrange. These individuals' burials had taken place in and around Newgrange. To be more explicit, they discovered that he had to have been born as a result of incestuous relations between first-degree relatives. He was probably certainly the offspring of a coupling between a brother or sister or a father and a child. The fact that he was related to other people who were buried nearby was further indication that he had links to the higher levels of society in that region over 5,000 years ago, as assessed by the researchers. Even though there isn't much written evidence to support this allegation, it's impossible to deny the evidence from the DNA. In the same vein, there is circumstantial evidence to suggest that only people in higher social positions in Stone Age Ireland were participating in this practice. After all, the bodies of those poor farmers weren't being laid to rest in an elegant tomb. As a result, it is possible that it is an echo of comparable situations that occurred in other ancient societies, such as the courts of the Egyptian pharaohs and the early royals in the Hawaiian kingdom. Short Creek Fels families. In the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS, the direction to have as many children as possible in polygamous marriages is coupled with the motivation to remain inside their highly strict theological organization. Both of these goals are intended to ensure the survival of the FLDS. On the other hand, the FLDS community of Short Creek, which is located on the state line between Utah and Arizona, has started to observe firsthand the impacts of generations upon generations of inbreeding. The issue was initially recognized in 1990 by pediatric neurologist Theodore Tarby, who was doing an examination on a little kid from the neighborhood at that time. The child had peculiar physical characteristics and considerable developmental deficits when they were first seen. It was discovered by Tarby that the boy had a rare genetic abnormality called fumarase deficiency. This condition severely hinders the body's ability to give energy and has a profound impact on the development of the brain. People who are afflicted with this condition are prone to having seizures and suffer from cognitive and physical problems. Faith Bistline, a former member of the FLDS Church, related to the BBC that she took care of 5 cousins who suffered from fumarase insufficiency. Only one of them was able to walk, and they all needed medical care, which included feeding tubes. At the time, there were just a few known examples of fumarase deficiency because the condition was so uncommon. But in the end, medical professionals discovered an astounding 8 new instances in the FLDS community at Short Creek. Their findings were published in the year 2000 issue of the journal Annals of Neurology. It is very clear that this was not a simple instance of a genetic mutation occurring at random. Instead, the tiny pool of individuals who are able to get married is to blame. This small pool is made even smaller by the expectation that men will have several wives, which eliminates the need for any other men and their genes. Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles II of Spain is the unhappy poster child for the problem of inbred royals. He is the king of Spain. It was certainly not his fault that he was born into the Habsburg dynasty, which, by the time he was born in 1661, was notoriously inbred due to the fact that the Habsburgs couldn't stand to dilute their wealth and power by marrying outsiders. Of course, it wasn't his fault that he was born into the Habsburg family. Because of how complicated everything became, Charles's parents were actually his niece and uncle, and his grandmother played both roles of his aunt and uncle. In addition to his physical defects, which featured the prominently protruding Habsburg jaw that runs in his family, Charles struggled with developmental delays, epilepsy, and even early-onset baldness. These issues plagued Charles throughout his life. An autopsy was performed on him after he passed away at the age of 38, and the report that they wrote stated that he purportedly had a heart that was so little that its size was similar to a peppercorn. In addition, his internal organs were seriously injured, and he had just one testicle that was blackened. Although it may appear that certain particulars have been exaggerated, it cannot be denied that Charles was dealt a poor genetic hand. The fact that Charles could not produce an heir was probably the event that was most detrimental to both Charles and the entire Habsburg family. He had 2 different wives, but they were unable to produce a kid for him. The diseases that are responsible for all of this are still a mystery, but recent research has pointed the finger at inherited renal abnormalities, issues with enzymes, and a pituitary gland that isn't working properly as possible causes. Whatever else may have been going on, the fact that Charles was unable to carry on the line of succession in Spain meant the end of the highly inbred Habsburg dynasty. Ancient Hawaiian royal family. In the early days of Hawaiian society, practically everyone lived their lives according to a strict social hierarchy. Many were considered to be maka'ainana, which are also known as commoners, and konohiki fell somewhere in the center. There was a limited group of people known as the ali'i, who occupied the highest point on the social hierarchy and were further subdivided into ranking groups. Because of the great level of respect that was required for the ali'i by a complex series of social customs known as kapu, the majority of people were expected to throw themselves face down when they were in the company of the highest-ranking chiefs. Despite the fact that royals put an end to the practice in the early 19th century, it was possible to lose one's life for violating a kapu. Prior to that seismic shift, on the other hand, the Ali had very little options available to them when it came to choosing a mate. At least in ancient Hawaii, the remedy was to wed a relative inside the first degree of one's family tree. Once upon a time, the practice was admired and thought to be a badge of the highest prestige. Children born from these unions were regarded to be of a particularly high level. However, Europeans who eventually landed in the islands found the practice to be absolutely revolting. In the 1820s, King Kamehameha III and his sister, Nahianena, found themselves in a difficult position emotionally. It is said that the two were quite close to one another and even tried to get married. However, Nahianena, who was torn between her traditional beliefs and her desire to embrace the newly introduced Christianity brought by missionaries, was ultimately convinced to marry another man. However, it is said that she did give birth to a kid by her brother, but sadly the boy did not survive long after his birth. About the age of 20, Nahianena passed away herself. Queen Victoria's family. Although Queen Victoria of England appeared to be in good health, her descendants have not been quite as fortunate. Victoria inherited the gene for hemophilia, a genetic illness in which the blood does not adequately clot, and sufferers run the risk of bleeding to death. Victoria had the potential to pass the trait on to her children. Inheritors who have XY chromosomes have the highest risk of developing the condition because it is connected to the X chromosome. This is due to the fact that these inheritors do not have another X chromosome that could contain a dominant gene to combat the recessive gene. Leopold, Victoria's own son, passed away at the young age of 30 from complications related to hemophilia. In spite of the fact that Leopold was the first known descendant of Victoria's to have hemophilia, it is extremely likely that he was not the last to develop the condition because the gene pool of European royals is somewhat small. The gene was carried to Spain by Victoria's granddaughter, Victoria Eugenie, while 3 of Victoria's grandsons perished as a result of the sickness. Alexandra, Victoria's other granddaughter, transported it all the way to Russia, where her only son, Crown Prince Alexei, was waiting for her there. After he was said to have assisted Alexei, this provided a window of opportunity for the infamous mystic Rasputin to win favor with the imperial family. Rasputin looked to have a great deal of influence over Alexandra and her family, but the royal family kept the heir's genetic condition a secret, so few people knew why this was the case. Reportedly, as a result of this, the situation became even more unstable, culminating in the murder of Rasputin, the murder of the Romanov family in 1918, and Lenin and his associates seizing control of the newly communist Russia. Was it just the result of Victoria's hemophilia gene, which had been enhanced by decades of inbreeding? No, but it most certainly did not make matters any better either. The Colt family. Sadly, some of the worst cases of inbreeding in the current day originate from homes where there is a great deal of physical and emotional abuse. Consider the Australian Colt family, for example. This is not their genuine name. The court has given them the alias Colt in order to safeguard the identities of the underage children who were victims of the abuse. And that atmosphere turned out to be particularly frightening, as the police began to discover beginning in the year 2010. In 2012, 12 children were taken away from their rural compound with their family at Burowa, in the state of New South Wales. The adults in the household were accused of severely neglecting the children in the areas of education, hygiene, and nutrition. The investigation led to the discovery of something that is even more unsettling. It was reported that multiple youngsters suffered from learning problems, and one of them had peculiar facial traits. It was quickly discovered that some had been the victims of sexual abuse at the hands of members of their own family, and that some of them had been the offspring of such abuse. Everything began in the 1960s when a couple known only as Timothy and June relocated from New Zealand to Australia. According to court statements from 2013, which were obtained by New Zealand Herald, June was the daughter of a brother and sister couple. Following their marriage, June and Tim Colt relocated to Australia, where they raised their 7 children. Tim molested his own children as well as his grandkids over the course of his lifetime, and other members of Tim's family did the same thing. DNA testing revealed the horrifying truth, despite the fact that several of the daughters denied the assault. Now, members of the Colt family still suffer from the genetic impacts of inbreeding as well as years of social isolation and mistreatment, both of which have made it far more challenging for them to integrate into wider society. Ludwig II of Bavaria. It was impossible for many European royal families to avoid the pressure to choose a partner from a respectable family who was also closely related to them. Another European dynasty with a particularly convoluted family tree was the German house of Wittelsbach, which ruled throughout Germany. Even though few Wittelsbachs could actually compare to the evident faults of Habsburgs like Charles II of Spain, they weren't without some peculiar behaviors, including mental illness that was believed to be hereditary and which impacted numerous members of the family. This was one of the more prominent examples. The reign of Ludwig II over Bavaria, which lasted from 1864 through 1886, is generally regarded as the most eventful. In general, he was uninterested in administration, and he spent his time instead busying himself with spending money on lavish building projects. The most well-known of his creations is the castle at Neuschwanstein, which was inspired by Ludwig's idealized love of fairy tales and revisionist history. The castle is dramatically positioned above a mountain ridge. It was thought that Ludwig's shaky grasp on reality was reflected in his many building projects, including how pretty the never completely finished palace was. Other building projects included the fact that by the 1880s, he had become somewhat of a recluse, and that on June 10, 1886, he was proclaimed crazy and unfit to reign did not help the situation. After only 3 more days, he took his own life by drowning in a lake that was close to one of his magnificent mansions. Others sided with the official verdict of suicide, while others have even suggested that the politically inconvenient Mad King was assassinated. Ferdinand I of Austria. Some of the inbred royals may have been able to slip under the radar, but others appeared to be so profoundly influenced by their lineage that it was obvious just by looking at them that something was awry. One such individual was Ferdinand I, who reigned as Emperor of Austria. His parents were the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II, also known as Francis I of Austria, and Maria Theresa, who was the ruler of Naples and Sicily at the time of his birth in 1793. It just so happened that the newlywed couple were also double first cousins who shared all of their grandparents. Even though there was no such thing as genetic testing in the late 18th century, the fact that the couple's son Ferdinand suffered from hydrocephalus, high amounts of fluid around the brain, speech trouble, and seizures throughout his life may be explained by the fact that the couple's son Ferdinand married a relative. There are other assertions made that he suffered from a cognitive handicap. According to the paintings of the emperor, the hydrocephalus caused him to have an unusually enormous head. This was another symptom of the condition. It is stated that poor Ferdinand suffered a seizure during the ceremony that marked his marriage to his distant cousin, Maria Anna of Piedmont, Sardinia, in the year 1831. They were unable to have children together, but at least Ferdinand was a kind man and a relatively well-liked ruler until political instability forced him to abdicate in December 1848. Ferdinand was 82 years old when he passed away in 1875, so even if his genes were the root of his alleged problems, they didn't have much of an impact on his lifetime. The Blue Fugates. According to a study that was conducted in 1980 and published in Central Issues in Anthropology, the rates of inbreeding in the Appalachian region were about the same as anywhere else in the United States. This finding proves that the stereotype of inbred Appalachians is largely untrue. There are, however, a few notable deviations from the rule. It's possible that the Blue Fugates stood out the most among all of them. Martin Fugate, who had been living in France, relocated to Kentucky about the year 1820 and began everything off. There he tied the knot with Elizabeth Smith, and the pair went on to have 7 children, 4 of whom have a blue complexion. Methemoglobinemia is a blood disorder in which patients have abnormally high levels of methemoglobin, a kind of hemoglobin, in their blood, and both of the patient's parents have a recessive gene for the condition in their DNA. Nevertheless, that protein is unable to effectively release oxygen. Cyanosis, which causes skin that is a startling shade of blue, is the result. At least for some people, depending on the specific condition. Other people may experience symptoms such as exhaustion, seizures, and developmental delays. Their descendants were restricted in the number of people from whom they might choose to marry as a result of the Fugates' decision to settle in a rural area at a time when it was difficult to travel vast distances. According to some accounts, Martin and Elizabeth's son had a child who went on to marry his own aunt. After a while, the family had a sufficient number of people with blue skin for the clan to earn the nickname Blue Fugates in the neighborhood. But as transportation improved, more people were able to marry outside of the group, which led to a decline in the incidence of methemoglobinemia in the family. Anyone who is still exhibiting the blue skin can see it fade away within minutes after ingesting a tablet of methylene blue, which transforms their faulty methemoglobin back into hemoglobin. This is possible with the modern medical care that is available. The Ptolemies. If the stories are to be believed, Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt, possessed a legendary beauty. The available evidence suggests that she had a somewhat unremarkable appearance. Nonetheless, this does not appear to have hindered her enormous political power, as she used her brains and personality to win over both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. It's possible that she and her family have a severe case of inbreeding. The Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 305 BC to 30 BC and included Cleopatra's forebears, had a great deal of interest in maintaining the family's hold on the throne. Because of this, there were only 6 persons who could be considered her great-great-grandparents, despite the fact that the average family tree has 16 generations. Cleopatra ended up marrying both her brother Ptolemy III and another brother, Ptolemy XIV, throughout the course of her life. These generations of inbreeding may have led to the obesity that was prevalent throughout the Ptolemaic era, which some scholars have hypothesized may have been caused by genetic thyroid disorders rather than simply living an extremely luxurious lifestyle. On the other hand, it is essential to keep in mind that ancient genealogies are notoriously difficult to pin down. This is especially true when we're talking about the royals of Ptolemaic Egypt, who had such a large number of wives and children, as well as documentation that wasn't in the best shape. As a result, it's challenging to acquire an accurate image of their ancestry. Furthermore, Cleopatra herself did not appear to be noticeably impacted by her genealogy, as seen by the fact that she ruled for 21 years before taking her own life at the age of 39. She was also known to have had 4 children, although none of them were by any of her family members. This provides some evidence that the Ptolemies may have had a more diverse gene pool than was previously believed. Kingston Clan. At the very least, a few of the Kingston Clan patriarchs believe that power is something that should be preserved at any cost. Charles Eldon Kingston laid the groundwork in 1935 for what would later become known as the Order, the Davis County Cooperative Society, and the Latter-day Church of Christ. The organization is headquartered in Salt Lake City. Since then, it is said to have isolating its members by using a strong and sometimes violent blend of racist rhetoric, apocalyptic fear-mongering, rigorously enforced patriarchal hierarchy, and anti-government posture. Polygamy is still practiced by members of the present Kingston congregation, which has historical ties to the early Mormon church. It is said that Eldon's brother, Ortel, fostered incest within the family in order to maintain the appearance of the family's moral rectitude. As a result, Ortel fathered children with 2 of his half-sisters as well as 2 of his nieces. His own descendants have continued the practice by marrying their half-siblings, cousins, and nieces, the majority of whom were only teenagers at the time. Even if the state law of Utah hardly recognizes polygamy between adults who consent to it as a subject of concern, marriages that are either coerced or performed by minors are still very much considered illegal and can result in a conviction for a felony. Members of the Kingston group, on the other hand, have been granted criminal sentences for tax fraud in 2023, despite the fact that the group's spokesperson have categorically rejected these allegations. It has been stated that members of the Kingston family do not mention fathers on birth certificates in an effort to make it more difficult to trace their familial links. This is despite the fact that the Kingstons maintain their policy of not discussing family matters. Due to the closed-off nature of the group, it has been difficult to investigate the impacts of inbreeding. However, it has been reported that inbreeding has resulted in offspring who have visual problems, skulls that are exceptionally small, and dwarfism, among other effects. Ancient Peruvian Elites. Even though Incan heirs were supposed to be the best choice, and not just the firstborn son, later royals decided that a ruler's heir should come from the son of his principal wife. This was the case even though Incan heirs were supposed to be the best choice. The transfer of power was ultimately determined to be a closely guarded family affair due to political maneuverings, and the desire to maintain control of the government for as long as possible. It is stated that Incan monarchs started marrying their sisters or half-sisters in an effort to cement their power, and also to put a stop to the violent plotting that went into pushing one contender ahead of another. In case any of that seems implausible, consider the fact that there is evidence based on genetics that ancient humans in the region engaged in intermarrying to a significant degree. Sarah K. Becker gave a presentation in 2017 at the annual meeting of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, where she discussed the findings of an excavation at a Peruvian burial site that spanned the years 500 AD to 1100 AD, via Forbes. The skeletal remains of 14 people were discovered to have an extremely rare spinal abnormality, which consisted of an additional lumbar vertebrae that was attached to the sacrum. The fact that so many people in one location had the ailment, in addition to the rarity of the condition itself, is evidence that there was a considerable amount of inbreeding. In another set of excavations, which took place in a cemetery in Lima, the capital of Peru, researchers discovered that at least some pre-Incan people from the Lima culture, which was at its peak between 400 to 1200 AD, engaged in acts of incest. Inbreeding had caused terrible hip and spine deformities in each of the 6 women who were discovered buried near an influential man. It is presumed that some of these ladies were some of the man's wives. Ancient Zoroastrians. Incest was usually seen as a serious taboo that broke both cultural customs and religious regulations throughout the ancient world, much like it is in many societies today. This view persists. However, among the Zoroastrians who lived in ancient Iran, the custom of marrying close relatives was occasionally elevated to the status of a holy ideal, and this concept was eventually given the name ex-Wedoda. Although Iranian books from the 9th and 10th centuries came out exceptionally strongly in support of Swadoda, it is unclear how often Zoroastrians in those times were actually marrying their parents or siblings. Nevertheless, these texts came out especially strongly in favor of Swadoda. The authors of the time undoubtedly took their time to create a bright picture of the ideal connected family, which was a common theme in their work. Some people argued that related parents would love their children more, get along better with one another, and, just like so many other communities before and after them who thought the same thing, would maintain their bloodlines apparently pure. According to the accounts of non-Zoroastrians who wrote about Swadoda, the practice was most likely carried out by the families of Zoroastrian elites, such as priests. On the other hand, it is not out of the question that individuals belonging to lower social classes took part in the practice. According to a statistical investigation that was published in Community Genetics, these kinds of weddings have even made their way into the regional folk tales. The analysis found that there is a higher-than-average rate of consanguineous marriages in the stories than there is in the real world. Although Islam frowns upon most types of consanguineous marriage, and Iran's population is now majority Muslim, first-cousin marriages are nevertheless traditionally thought to be permissible in some Iranian communities today. House of Briganza. Look no farther than Portugal's House of Briganza to dispel the notion that all of the inbreeding among European royal families was confined to the Spanish Habsburgs or the descendants of Victoria, Queen of England. In an issue of the American Journal of Human Biology released in 2018, researchers came to the conclusion that out of the 17 known marriages that involved members of the dynasty, 8 couples were equivalent to those of second-cousin marriages or marriages that were even closer in relation. These included a marriage between first cousins, as well as a marriage between an uncle and a niece. In addition, the researchers discovered that the average longevity of a Briganza was much lower when compared to that of the general population. It is possible that Maria I of Portugal, who was the first queen to rule Portugal in her own right, is one of the most eye-catching examples of what the House of Briganza caused as a result of all of the inbreeding that took place. We are unable to state with absolute certainty that her problems were the result of inbreeding because the genetic complexities of the Briganza family have not been researched to the same extent as those of the Habsburg family. But Maria, who was the one who married her uncle, did have problems that could possibly be linked to the complicated family tree she came from. She gave off the impression that she suffered from manic and depressed episodes along with psychosis, all of which are symptoms that are consistent with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. On the other hand, she had a very difficult life because she lost both her husband and her eldest son, as well as living through the bloody events of the French Revolution and the rise to power of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the late fall of 187, when Napoleon invaded Portugal, Maria and her family were forced to flee the country and eventually settled in Brazil, where Maria passed away in 1816. Neanderthals. Even though the last known Neanderthal died out some 40,000 years ago, genetics has let us learn a significant amount about these close human relatives. According to a study that was conducted in 2013 and published in the journal Nature, there was one Neanderthal woman who lived in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Her toe bone, which was 50,000 years old, had genetic material, and analysis of that material revealed that her parents were most likely half-siblings. Her DNA suggests at quite a few more instances of inbreeding in the family line and implies that Neanderthals, Denisovans, another near relative, and anatomically modern humans were already interbreeding at this point, possibly bringing in much-needed genetic variety. Her ancestors include Neanderthals, Denisovans, and anatomically modern humans. But why did Neanderthals have such a high rate of inbreeding? To the best of anyone's knowledge, it does not appear that they were attempting to establish significant dynastic ties across Ice Age Europe and Asia. According to the evidence that has been uncovered, Neanderthals lived in groups that were typically quite tiny and somewhat separated from one another. In point of fact, that very well may have been the problem. Because there were so few potential mates in the area, it's possible that Neanderthals' romantic options were limited to their cousins and other even more distant relatives. This is because there were so few potential mates nearby. A report that was published in 2019 in the journal PLOS ONE implies that this could have resulted in a drop in the reproductive fitness of the generations that followed, resulting in Neanderthal groups with decreasing population numbers. They would have also been more susceptible to genetic disorders and might not have had the same level of resilience in the face of environmental stressors as the modern humans who finally took over their region and had a more genetically diversified population. Maria Antonia of Austria. The title of most inbred member of the Spanish Habsburg family is more appropriately awarded to Charles II of Spain's niece, Maria Antonia of Austria, commonly known as Marie Antoine of Habsburg. Charles II of Spain is known to be one of the notoriously inbred members of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. She has the greatest known inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related someone is to their own ancestors, in the whole family, as determined by an investigation published in Heredity. It is higher than the inbreeding coefficient of someone who was born of a parent-child union or to complete siblings, which is the case with Maria. To be more explicit, Maria's father, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, was both her mother Margaret Theresa's uncle and her first cousin. Margaret Theresa was Maria's mother. Margaret Theresa suffered from a severe case of inbreeding herself. Some people have even advanced the theory that she had a genetically compromised immune system, which contributed to her untimely death during childbirth. It's possible that this is also the reason why Maria Antonia was the only child of the couple to survive childhood. Nevertheless, the lack of postpartum and pediatric care that was available in the 17th century was certainly not an asset either. Despite this, Maria Antonia appeared to be remarkably unharmed by the genetic legacy she inherited. She was supposed to wed her own uncle, Charles II, but the wedding was reputedly called off since he was only 12 years old, and she was only 6 years old at the time, and the family required heirs more rapidly than a pair of school-aged kids could manage. It is possible that Charles was already visibly affected by the inbreeding that occurred within his own family, which did not assist the situation. Instead, Maria Antonia wed Maximilian II, the ruler of Bavaria, and produced a small number of offspring before passing away in December 1692 due to problems during childbirth. She was just 23 years old at the time of her death. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.